of God, which mobilized the Shia underclass and gradually placed it under the leadership of the theocratic dictatorship in Iran that had come to power 3 years previously. It was in lovely Lebanon too, having learned to share the kidnapping business with the ranks of organized crime, that the faithful moved on to introduce us to the beauties of suicide bombing. I can still see that severed head in the road outside the near-shattered French embassy. On the whole, I tended to cross the street when the prayer meetings broke up. Bombay also used to be considered a pearl of the Orient, with its necklace of lights along the Corniche and its magnificent British Raj architecture. It was one of India's most diverse and plural cities, and its many layers of texture have been cleverly explored by Salman Rushdie, especially in The Moor's Last Sigh and in the films of Mira Nair. It is true that there had been intercommunal fighting there during the time in 1947-48 when the grand historic movement for Indian self-government was being ruined by Muslim demands for a separate state and by the fact that the Congress Party was led by a pious Hindu. But probably as many people took refuge in Bombay during that moment of religious bloodlust as were driven or fled from it, a form of cultural coexistence resumed, as often happens when cities are exposed to the sea and to influences from outside. Parsis, former Zoroastrians who had been persecuted in Persia, were a prominent minority, and the city was also host to a historically significant community of Jews. But this was not enough to content Mr. Bal Thackeray and his Shiv Sena Hindu nationalist movement, who in the 1990s decided that Bombay should be run by and for his co-religionists, and who loosed a tide of goons and thugs onto the streets. Just to show he could do it, he ordered the city renamed as Mumbai, which is partly why I include it in this list under its traditional title. Belgrade had until the 1980s been the capital of Yugoslavia, or the land of the southern Slavs, which meant by definition that it was the capital of a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional state. But a secular Croatian intellectual once gave me a warning that, as in Belfast, took the form of a sour joke. If I tell people that I'm an atheist and a Croat, he said, people ask me how I can prove I'm not a Serb. To be Croatian, in other words, is to be Roman Catholic. To be a Serb is to be Christian Orthodox. In the 1940s, this meant a Nazi puppet state, set up in Croatia and enjoying the patronage of the Vatican, which naturally sought to exterminate all the Jews in the region, but also undertook a campaign of forcible conversion directed at the other Christian community. Tens of thousands of Orthodox Christians were either slaughtered or deported in consequence, and a vast concentration camp was set up near the town of Jasenovac. So disgusting was the regime of General Ante Pavelic and his Ustasha party that even many German officers protested at having to be associated with it. By the time I visited the site of the Jasenovac camp in 1992, the jackboot was somewhat on the other foot. The Croatian cities of Vukovar and Dubrovnik had been brutally shelled by the armed forces of Serbia, now under the control of Slobodan Milosevic. The mainly Muslim city of Sarajevo had been encircled and was being bombarded around the clock. Elsewhere in Bosnia-Herzegovina, especially along the river Drina, whole towns were pillaged and massacred in what the Serbs themselves termed ethnic cleansing. In point of fact, religious cleansing would have been nearer the mark. Milosevic was an ex-communist bureaucrat who'd mutated into a xenophobic nationalist, and his anti-Muslim crusade, which was a cover for the annexation of Bosnia to a greater Serbia, was to a large extent carried out by unofficial militias operating under his deniable control. These gangs were made up of religious bigots, often blessed by Orthodox priests and bishops, and sometimes augmented by fellow Orthodox volunteers from Greece and Russia. They made a special attempt to destroy all evidence of Ottoman civilization, as in the specially atrocious case of the dynamiting of several historic minarets in Banja Luka, which was done during a ceasefire and not as the result of any battle. The same was true, as is often forgotten, of their Catholic counterparts. The Ustasha formations were revived in Croatia and made a vicious attempt to take over Herzegovina, as they had during the Second World War. The beautiful city of Mostar was also shelled and besieged, and the world-famous Stari Most, or Old Bridge, dating from Turkish times and listed by UNESCO as a cultural site of world importance, was bombarded until it fell into the river below. In effect, the extremist Catholic and Orthodox forces were colluding in a bloody partition and cleansing of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They were, and still are, largely spared the public shame of this because the world's media preferred the simplification of Croat and Serb, and only mentioned religion when discussing the Muslims. But the triad of terms Croat, Serb and Muslim is unequal and misleading in that it equates two nationalities in one religion. The same blunder is made in a different way in coverage of Iraq, with the Sunni, Shia, Kurd trilateral. There were at least 10,000 Serbs in Sarajevo throughout the siege, and one of the leading commanders of its defence, an officer and gentleman named General Jovan Divjak, whose hand I was proud to shake under fire, was a Serb also. The city's Jewish population, which dated from 1492, also identified itself, for the most part, with the government and the cause of Bosnia. It would have been far more accurate if the press and television had reported that today the Orthodox Christian forces resumed their bombardment of Sarajevo, or yesterday the Catholic militia succeeded in collapsing the Stari Most. But confessional terminology was reserved only for Muslims, even as their murderers went to all the trouble of distinguishing themselves by wearing large Orthodox crosses over their bandoliers, or by taping portraits of the Virgin Mary to their rifle butts. Thus, once again, religion poisons everything, including our own faculties of discernment. As for Bethlehem, I suppose I would be willing to concede to Mr. Prager that on a good day I would feel safe enough standing around outside the Church of the Nativity as evening came on. It is in Bethlehem, not far from Jerusalem, that many believe that with the cooperation of an immaculately conceived virgin, God was delivered of a son. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was in this wise. When his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Yes, and the Greek demigod Perseus was born when the god Jupiter visited the virgin Danae as a shower of gold and got her with child. The god Buddha was born through an opening in his mother's flank. Catlicus the serpent skirted caught a little ball of feathers from the sky and hid it in her bosom, and the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli was thus conceived. The virgin Nana took a pomegranate from the tree, watered by the blood of the slain Agdestris, and laid it in her bosom, and gave birth to the god Attis. The virgin daughter of a Mongol king awoke one night and found herself bathed in a great light, which caused her to give birth to Genghis Khan. Krishna was born of the virgin Devaka. Horus was born of the virgin Isis. Mercury was born of the virgin Maya. Romulus was born of the virgin Rhea Silvia. For some reason, many religions force themselves to think of the birth canal as a one-way street, and even the Koran treats the Virgin Mary with reverence. However, this made no difference during the Crusades, when a papal army set out to recapture Bethlehem and Jerusalem from the Muslims, incidentally destroying many Jewish communities, and sacking heretical Christian Byzantium along the way, and inflicted a great massacre in the narrow streets of Jerusalem where, according to the hysterical and gleeful chroniclers, the spilled blood reached up to the bridles of the horses. Some of these tempests of hatred and bigotry and bloodlust have passed away, though new ones are always impending in this area. But meanwhile a person can feel relatively unmolested in and around Manger Square, which is the centre, as its name suggests, of a tourist trap of such unrelieved tawdriness as to put Lourdes itself to shame. When I first visited this pitiful town, it was under the nominal control of a largely Christian Palestinian municipality, linked to one particular political dynasty identified with the Frege family. When I have seen it since, it has generally been under a brutal curfew imposed by the Israeli military authorities, whose presence on the West Bank is itself not unconnected with belief in certain ancient scriptural prophecies, though this time with a different promise made by a different God to a different people. Now comes the turn of still another religion. The forces of Hamas, who claim the whole of Palestine as an Islamic waqf, or holy dispensation, sacred to Islam, have begun to elbow aside the Christians of Bethlehem. Their leader, Mahmoud al-Azhar, has announced that all inhabitants of the Islamic State of Palestine will be expected to conform to Muslim law. In Bethlehem, it is now proposed that non-Muslims be subjected to the Al-Jizya tax, the historic levy imposed on dhimmis or unbelievers under the old Ottoman Empire. Female employees of the